No. It must be, it must be. She's no better than the rest. I've got to go on.
Good evening, guys and ghouls, and welcome back to Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. I am your host, Ian Garcia. The smash success of Universal's Dracula and Frankenstein during the industry-wide belt-tightening of the Great Depression inevitably spurred the competing majors to fast-track their own competing fare. But the economic downturn also proved a prodigious moment for independent and poverty row outfits, eager as ever to nibble around the lower margins of the commercial film industry. Founded in 1931, W. Ray Johnston and Trem Carr's Monogram Pictures towered above the fray in terms of the sheer output and longevity. But throughout the first half of the 30s, American audiences were kept sated with a steady diet of low-budget programmers that were distributed through various means, such as the more traditional route of Monogram and their competitors Majestic and Chesterfield Pictures, the more regionally focused minority audience specialty of Sac Amusement Enterprises, or the more unscrupulous roadshow attractions pioneered by Dwayne Esper, whose own output, more than any others, is probably definitive in the modern mind when it comes to deployment of the term exploitation film. Together, along with the majors, these studios put out dozens of classical horror films. But in historical terms, the classic horror cycle goes beyond films that most aficionados and film buffs would now classify as definitively seated within the canon of horror as genre. Just as with what we now casually and retrospectively deem science fiction, that which we call horror fiction tends to be inextricable from broader literary and philosophical traditions, such as Romanticism and the Gothic novel, that don't necessarily implicate the sorts of tropes and narrative formulas that we now immediately associate with horror. Indeed, a coherent sense of horror as a specific genre of fiction was a relatively recent phenomenon at the very time that these films were being created and released. As such, while contemporary audiences, critics, and scholars were no doubt and evidently aware that they were witness to a specific trend in commercial filmmaking, the schema through which this trend was understood, and reciprocally, the schema through which this trend was understood and the methods through which film producers attempted to capitalize upon this trend were much more general and non-exclusive than we might anticipate. It shouldn't come as a particular surprise that Universal's Dracula itself was advertised to audiences just as much as a Gothic romance as an example of Gothic horror. After all, Stoker's original scenario is nothing if not a love triangle, merely an elaborate variation on a melodramatic formula in which a slick, sophisticated seducer attempts to woo the affections of a taken woman. Universal's publicity department, in turn, were well aware that they were selling Bela Lugosi on the basis of not only how his appearance and performance made him appear provocatively unusual and horrific, but also on the basis of how he was perceived to appeal specifically to a female audience. His piercing gaze, his exotic accent, his self-possessed bad boy attitude. The overall atmosphere of the film itself is similarly contradictory, at least from a modern standpoint. Owing in part to its already high budget, no original music was composed for the film, which plays largely to ambient silence. Instead, classical music pieces were used sparingly, the most evident being, of course, the film's opening credits, set to a melancholy excerpt from Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake. While suitable to inspiring dread, the choice is more evocatively complex, and inevitably draws parallels between Tchaikovsky's own ballet and the film itself. It traces an emotional arc that begins with our entrance upon a world of surreal unreality, proceeds to sweeping romance, and then crushes us with nightmarish tragedy. Dracula was, of course, only doing with synchronized sound what its antecedents in silent Hollywood had already done. The choices for early adaptations in film of horror literature are telling enough of the particular affinity for the still recent and still prominent Romanticist and Gothic traditions. Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Hugo's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Leroux's The Phantom of the Opera. Horror in these films was motivated by a thematic emphasis on the unusual, the unknown, and the monstrous. But to call them horror films does not always leave one with an accurate impression of their overall tone, or of the visceral emotions they produce. They are romantic dramas, historical fictions, and tragic parables as much as they are antecedent works of horror. Just as important to the development of film horror, especially in the American idiom, are the crime film and the black comedy. Lurid tales of murder, revenge, and subterfuge are ideal vehicles for thematically emphasizing monstrosity, as in The Penalty, One Exciting Night, and The Gorilla. Just as often, however, they are opportunities to cast levity on human foibles, particularly our venal passion for wealth and, in self-aware fashion, our susceptibility to illusions that in the same light go from being horrifying to absurd. This was certainly the case with Roland West's The Monster and the Bat, as well as The Cat and the Canary. In either case, this genre of macabre or tongue-in-cheek mysteries serves to further clarify the significance of the later sound era. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde notwithstanding, representations of the horrific in film before the 1930s were dominated by stories in which the monstrous was embodied in a fully corporeal sense, in physical and moral ugliness, and in which virtually all overtures of the supernatural and the weird were inevitably revealed to be merely elaborate illusions. Thoroughly modern in their outlook, they strive to return the spectator to a position of reactionary security in the signifiers of the rational, the enlightened, the civilized. Early sound horror films, or rather their financial success, significantly shifted the emphasis of future horror films in favor of the supernatural and the weird. It is not to say that macabre and black comic mysteries did not continue to prevail upon the silver screen well into the 40s. Rather, films such as Dracula and Frankenstein so radically charted the legacy of the horror film as a coherent genre that many of their more grounded contemporaries are, at best, typically treated as only adjacent to or bordering on the genre, despite being conceived and advertised by studios as part of the same cycle of exploitation. Author and film historian Bryan Senn's Golden Horrors, a critical filmography of horror films released from 1931 through 1939, contains an entire appendix of borderline horrors, as well as lost films and foreign exclusions. Naturally, many of these exclusions from the main text are editorially necessary. There were numerous films released by both major studios and Poverty Row outfits during this time which were merely deceptively advertised as having horrific content, despite their content itself having very little in the way of even the bare minimum overtures of horror as your standard macabre mystery might. But the sheer volume of these sorts of contemporary macabre crime films serves to clarify the extent to which what qualifies as a true horror film and what is merely the borderline horror at this time is purely in the eye of the beholder, or may even represent a misapplication of one's judgment of a film's relative success or failure in inspiring horror, to the question of whether it is or isn't, so to speak, a horror film. For instance, Senn classifies a previous entry on this podcast, Night of Terror, as a borderline horror, whereas The Ghoul, also previously covered on this podcast, is classified as definitive horror, despite both films basically being old dark house mysteries in which there is no supernatural content and everything weird is an illusion. Similarly, The Mask of Fu Manchu is classified definitively as an example of horror, whereas the black comic monogram ripoff The Mysterious Mr. Wong is not. Clearly, at a certain point, from a perspective of film history, we have to acknowledge that, to a certain extent, virtually all so-called horror films released during this nascent period of the genre's development occupied a borderline, so to speak, with other pre-established genres and traditions of popular culture, be they gothic or scientific romance, crime films, or black comedies. While Senn cites it in the main body of his filmography and not as a borderline horror, one could easily see classifying Majestic Pictures' 1933 film The Vampire Bat as just such a product that straddles the borderline between the macabre crime film and the modern horror movie. A remote German village is beset by a series of gruesome nighttime murders in which the victims are discovered with distinct puncture wounds on their necks and their bodies drained of blood, leading its God-fearing populace to believe that they are being plagued by vampires. Melvin Douglas plays police detective Carl Bretschneider, who initially dismisses and mocks this mounting folksy hysteria. Nonetheless, as the bodies continue to pile up and with no clues to go on, he steadily acclimates to the possibility that he is dealing with forces of weird, supernatural evil. Nudging him along to this conclusion is the town's general physician and private scientist, Dr. Otto von Niemann, played by Lionel Atwill, whose confident objectivity stands in persuasive contrast to the superstitious fervor of the town elders.
Do you mean to say that such a thing as a human vampire is possible?
Who can say? Historic records would have us believe that an evil soul, assuming there is such, can take any shape it pleases.
Have you any literature on the subject, Doctor?
Yes, I have many interesting volumes on my shelf that might prove very enlightening. I'll be glad to show them to you.
I don't mind admitting that I'm up a tree. Stumped.
While Bretschneider continues to consult von Niemann, the prime suspect of the villagers becomes Hermann Glebe, a vagrant idiot who wanders the streets at all hours of the night and takes on bats as his personal pets. When Hermann's main accuser turns up dead one morning, Bretschneider approves of his arrest. Of course, though, the mob has far less on its mind than due process. With dogs and torches at the ready, they pursue Hermann into the caves outside of town, chasing him into a pit where he falls to his death. Leaving nothing to chance, one of the town elders prepares to descend into the pit by rope and, off-screen, drives a stake through the dead Hermann's chest. Meanwhile, that very evening, von Niemann's maid produces a crucifix belonging to one of the vampire's most recent victims, which she finds in the bedroom of Emil, von Niemann's manservant.
Have you mentioned this to anyone?
I intend to tell Herr Bretschneider when he calls again.
Leave this with me. I want to talk to Emil before you say anything to anyone.
The Burgermeister should know at once.
Yes, all in good time. Emil has been with me too long for us to jump to conclusions.
After the maid retires, Emil emerges from his bedroom dressed in a long black cape. Apparently controlling Emil through telepathy, von Niemann has the maid murdered and brought to his laboratory, the centerpiece of which is a pulsating sponge of living tissue submerged in a tank. Von Niemann straps the dead woman to a gurney and attaches a pair of queer-looking calipers with syringe tips to her neck, draining the blood from the body into a volumetric flask. It is thus revealed that von Niemann has been experimenting in the creation of life, and is using the blood of his victims to feed his amorphous creation. Later on, Bretschneider arrives to continue picking von Niemann's brain, only for the body of the maid to be discovered in her bed. Knowing that Hermann was spotted lurking around the grounds of the mansion earlier that day, Bretschneider is confident that he has finally found his culprit, only for the town Burgermeister to arrive and ecstatically inform him that the prime suspect has died about an hour before the maid was killed. Atwill's scene-stealing facial performance here is a big highlight of the film, the dramatic irony compounded by his vain attempt to steer attention away from him by harping on the vampire angle. Von Niemann may be a mad genius in a town full of idiots, but like many very smart people, he has woefully underestimated the ingenuity of true idiots.
But a natural death wouldn't kill a vampire, Carl. You know the accepted theory. A stake driven through the heart.
Oh, yes, that's the theory, all right.
But what?
But they did. They drove a stake through his heart.
Good God, are we living in the Middle Ages?
It wasn't through my sanction, Carl. Basawa did it. He told me so himself.
With renewed conviction that the culprit of the murders is a corporeal madman and not an undead ghoul, Brett Schneider is determined to sweep von Niemann's house from top to bottom. The desperate doctor is nonetheless able to convince him to stay the night as his guest first, sure to give him a poisonous dose of sleeping tablets before the inspector retires. While Brett Schneider lies in bed, Emil, once again under von Niemann's control, crawls across the mansion rooftop and through the inspector's window. When von Niemann is discovered by Ruth, his lady lab assistant played by none other than Fay Wray, he ties her up and gags her in his laboratory while he awaits Emil with the inspector's body. In the dark, Emil appears to enter with Brett Schneider wrapped in a shroud. But when von Niemann pulls back the cover, he instead discovers an unconscious Emil, and Brett Schneider disguised in Emil's cape and a black hat. Holding the mad doctor at gunpoint, Brett Schneider is nonetheless distracted by his attempt to first free Ruth, and a brawl ensues between the two men. Coming to, Emil picks up the gun and trains it on von Niemann. Brett Schneider and Ruth leave the room, after which we hear 2 gunshots coming from inside the chamber. When Brett Schneider returns, he finds both men dead, Emil having first killed von Niemann before turning the gun on himself. The intention of the filmmakers to capitalize on Universal's success is transparent from the very opening titles of The Vampire Bat. The background illustration of a huge bat, its wings partially outstretched, clearly inspired by the Art Deco gargoyle from the opening titles of Dracula. But studio founder and executive producer Larry Darmour looms above his Poverty Row contemporaries in terms of his ingenuity in working through the limitations of his production to make it seem that much more like a prestigious Universal, RKO, or Warner Brothers feature. Indeed, an essential component of the film's successful simulation of Universal horror is that Darmour was able to cheaply lease the struggling Universal city's own standing sets for his own knockoff. The village exteriors, for instance, were originally constructed for the 1930 adaptation of All Quiet on the Western Front, and were then repurposed for Frankenstein. The wine cellar set from Frankenstein also appears in The Vampire Bat as a makeshift morgue, and von Niemann's mansion itself is none other than the old dark house from Universal's 1932 film of the same name. Darmour and otherwise unremarkable director Frank Strayer seem to have strived to get the most out of their access to these spaces as possible, with cinematographer Ira H. Morgan's camera craning dynamically over the exteriors and tracking smoothly in an interior scene of the film's first on-screen murder to suggest, as Senn reads it, the eerie point of view of the vampire itself. Completing the illusion of this off-brand prestige horror is the casting of a significant number of freelance cast-offs from the major studios. Our hero, Melvin Douglas, had played a main supporting role in Universal's The Old Dark House just the year before, and now returned to the very same sets to star in The Vampire Bat. For his part, Lionel Atwill had previously played an eccentric scientist, though this time, spoiler alert, not the murderer, in Warner Brothers' Dr. X. Playing his daughter in that film was none other than Fay Wray, and at the time The Vampire Bat began production, Atwill and Wray had just wrapped playing opposite each other once again in another Warner Brothers production, The Mystery of the Wax Museum. Even compared to her contemporary roles and the sexist standards of Hollywood in general, The Vampire Bat sees Wray playing a virtually non-existent love interest and damsel role, which is considerably beneath her talents. But nonetheless, The Vampire Bat is notable at least simply for its situation in the most prolific moment of the actress's career. Already fairly successful, Ray would either star or prominently feature in no less than 14 films between 1932 and 1933, and buoyed on the waves of the pre-code horror cycle, it is during this period that she would end up being immortalized as a screen icon and the original Scream Queen. In addition to Dr. X, The Vampire Bat, and Mystery of the Wax Museum, she would also be seen in RKO's productions of The Most Dangerous Game and, last but certainly not least, the granddaddy of them all, King Kong. To round out the cast, Majestic acquired Dwight Fry for the role of Herman Glebe. Fry at this point was already beginning to chafe from Hollywood typecasting, Senn quoting him from the Vampire Bat press book as saying, quote, "If God is good, I will be able to play comedy in which I was featured on Broadway for 8 seasons and in which no producer of motion pictures will give me a chance. And please, God, may it be before I go screwy playing idiots, halfwits, and lunatics on the talking screen." That said, Fry is a natural for the part of the idiot, half-wit lunatic of the Vampire Bat, having previously played the Mad Renfield in Dracula, as well as the Hunchback Fritz in Frankenstein. Via this economical exploitation of pre-made sets and pre-vetted actors at a time when the major studios were struggling and actors themselves were easier to afford for cheap, quick B pictures made by independents, Darmour was effectively able to fashion a competent production with many of the signifiers of a more modern horror film, while the economically limited script by Edward T. Lowe Jr. nonetheless fundamentally adhered to the conventions of a macabre murder mystery. With its rustic European setting and foregrounding of vampire mythology, the plotline of the film is obviously inspired by Dracula, whereas the climactic reveal that von Neumann is experimenting in the creation of life is clearly derived from Frankenstein. One could argue that the latter feature of the narrative more than anything else sufficiently removes the Vampire Bat from the borderline terrain of exploitative murder mysteries to reveal a definitive example of modern pre-code horror. But I would counter that this science fiction angle of the film was prosaic enough, that genre itself not having yet been coherently defined either, and that its generic significance is comparatively minuscule when considered against the film's narrative emphasis, which is not the particular revelation of what von Neumann is doing in his lab. Rather, the emphasis remains on von Neumann as a mere murderer, with tension arising from the dramatic irony of our knowing that he is the murderer, whereas we do not know if our law-enforcing hero knows it, or how a just order will be restored. While von Neumann is an archetypal mad scientist, and in his Germanic name and specific experiments obviously derived from Frankenstein, the archetype of the mad scientist itself, like all motifs of the horrific that are only at this point steadily cohering into a definitive genre, stems from a whole panoply of villainous wizards, hypnotists, and Svengalis that pervade not just Gothic tradition, but also fairy tales and mythology. For instance, besides Frankenstein, von Neumann's use of some form of telepathy or hypnotism is clearly also evocative of Norbert Jacques' Dr. Mabuse, or better yet, Robert Wien's The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Emile himself in this context is a dead ringer for the somnambulist slave who commits murders on the mad doctor's behalf. There is an element of the horrific in what these characters do, the extent to which it reveals or suggests something innately monstrous about the character of human beings or the nature of power to corrupt otherwise brilliant individuals. We can also identify qualities of the horrific derived from the susceptibility of people as a mass to superstition and hysteria, our myopic psyches projected outward and reshaping the rational world in a horrific image. The persecution and abjection of Herman by the town mob is what I'm thinking about here, which in itself can be compared to another work of German expressionism, Fritz Lang's M. But as to the question of whether The Vampire Bat is a definitive horror or a borderline horror, insofar as we might entertain these potential distinctions from a historical perspective, the answer is one of emphasis and not content. Lang's considerably more expressive style notwithstanding, M is clearly less concerned with the prosecution of justice than with depicting the monstrous interiority of human nature, and is thus far more definitively a work of horror. The Vampire Bat, on the other hand, like many B and Poverty Row macabre mysteries, is all about the investigation, in sussing out the wrongdoers, and, most importantly, reasserting a sense of rational order after the horrific has been revealed.
Well, that ends the vampire theory as far as I'm concerned. Oh, no, there's some human agency at work here, Doctor. A madman who kills to satisfy some violent, sadistic urge.
Yes, you're right, Carl. I've been a fool, a superstitious fool.
Frankly speaking, even von Neumann's powers of telepathy or hypnotism aren't terribly out of sync with the mundane powers of mad scientists in other tentatively borderline horror movies, or even generic mysteries themselves. Powers of intelligence are persistently mystified in popular culture to the extent that science itself might as well be a form of magic, even in a supposedly grounded mystery that is all about deducing the most logical conclusion to a series of clues. The Vampire Bat is certainly no great mystery, but where it fundamentally presents an evolutionary dead end in the evolution of the horror film is precisely in its insistence upon a rationalist view of events, even as it embroils the clearly fantastic in the form of mad science. The mad science itself is only revealed as the true, rational form of mental disturbance and crime, which only assumes the disguise of the weird and the supernatural. The implicitly supernatural qualities of the science itself isn't dwelled upon at all, which even prevents it from becoming impressively weird. These are not, for lack of a better term, true horrors as far as the film is concerned. They are merely brief disturbances in a rational, reasoned perspective. The filmmakers were incredibly diligent in co-opting the signifiers of films like Dracula and Frankenstein, and they outshone their similarly budgeted contemporaries in this department. But still exceeding the grasp of their exploitation was the premise of the supernatural and the weird becoming an irresolvable focus of the narrative itself. The conclusion of The Vampire Bat, to say nothing of Herman's fate, is very grim indeed, but this is still a rudimentary mystery only bordering upon the horrific. It lacks an earnest preoccupation with the monstrous, the supernatural, and the weird as evocative of human nature, our worst fears about the world around us and what may even reside within ourselves, as opposed to its merely being a facade and aberration of an insufficiently dry and rational worldview.